I think that we have to be slightly careful to pretend that up until January this year, when Donald Trump went back into the White House, that we had a completely independent central banking system that never got complicated with the wants and needs of politicians. I think that's been a little bit hypocritical.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Michael Simmons, and today I want to talk to you about what's going on with Trump's tariffs. April saw the president unveil his tariff regime for the world. Britain ended up negotiating the lowest possible tariff, 10%, as you can see from the table here. In contrast to many other countries, we've come off fairly well. That's partly because our trade with the US is more or less balanced, and it's trade that Trump really cares about. If you look at this graph here, which is the Americans' view of their trade with Britain, you see that on goods we basically import and export the same amount. Now, there's some disagreement when it comes to services. If you were to look at the Office for National Statistics trade data, they say we have a massive services surplus with America. This graph from Trump's side disagrees, but the important thing for him is that trade balances out. Now, Trump's goal was to create an external revenue service. And despite predictions of economic doom, so far at least, he's succeeded. You can see here the revenues from tariffs. They're currently at something like $160 billion, and they're expected to hit $300 billion at the end of the year. So the revenues are coming in, but how well is it doing in the rest of the economy? One of the goals of the administration was to get America building again and to increase manufacturing jobs. But if you look at the graph we're showing now, manufacturing jobs are continuing to decline. Joining me to discuss all this is The Spectator's Deputy US Editor, Kate Andrews. Kate, great to have you back in London again.
It's great to be back, Michael.
Now, recently I spoke to Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, when he was in Stockholm negotiating with the Chinese, and I asked him if he was ready to declare victory on Trump's tariff policies. Now, the kind of economic school of thought that I think most people come from, certainly I think it's fair to say that you come from, is that, tariffs are always a bad thing. But if you look at the sort of slideshow that I introduced the show with, there's a lot of arguments that Bessent and also Trump can and have been making that actually this tariff policy has worked for America. Do you agree?
I think it really depends on how you define working for America. There's absolutely no doubt that these massive tariffs are bringing in a lot of money to the US Treasury. I think in June this year, the tariff receipts were close to $30 billion. That's 3 or 5 times higher than they were the previous year. I can't quite remember, but every month we're seeing a huge shift upward. Trump and Bessent are doing a very good job of bringing more money in. When Trump talks about the trillions of dollars that are flowing into the Treasury, it's not trillions, but it could well be, it was certainly billions, and it could well be hundreds of billions at some point. And there is talk in Republican and Democratic circles about what to do with that money. Now, that really should be the red flag, right? That it isn't just Republicans, but it's also Democrats going, oh my goodness, we found this new incredible source of income. When politicians start to say that, you really have to look at where it's coming from and go, okay, well, who's paying it? And the difficulty for Trump and Bessent, and this is about to get a lot harder, is can you say this is working for America when it is largely Americans paying the price? Which is to say, this is not a transfer of income from other countries to the US Treasury. It's a transfer of income from American workers, American business owners to the US Treasury. This has been described quite rightly as the biggest tax hike on Americans in modern history. And yeah, you can bring in the income, but who's paying that price? And that is something that Trump and Bessent and the Trump administration will not say out loud. That is the unspeakable part, because a huge part of Trump's narrative is tax cuts. The one big beautiful bill was all about slashing tax and bringing those costs down for your average American worker. At the same time, he is dramatically increasing tax on American corporations that would import things from other parts of the world. That has knock-on effects on workers in terms of wages and on consumers in terms of prices. And you can see in a lot of the data, particularly the jobs numbers from over the summer, which led to some firings in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Trump didn't like the numbers. He wants to find somebody who will give him better and bigger and happier numbers. But the truth is that hiring has slowed quite substantially, a lot more so than people thought. And also, you did show a slide, I think there, Michael, of manufacturing jobs. Despite these huge taxes on American workers so far anyway, and this is a medium to long-term game for the president, we're not seeing a massive uptick in the number of people being hired into these manufacturing jobs that he has promised on every campaign trail he's ever been on. So, I mean, you tell me, is that working? Is that a win? If you say that bit out loud, that Trump won't say, that this is a tax on America, does that completely change the narrative? I think it does.
Does he need to say that out loud, though? Because isn't there an argument, or, I've certainly heard the argument made that because Trump is so uncertain, right? Because if you're a business in America, you don't know month to month what the tariff policy is going to be, or it's a bit more concrete now, but certainly in the first half of this year, everything was up in the air. So a lot of companies actually haven't made those pricing decisions yet, and therefore the American consumer, the American worker, is not actually paying this tariff tax.
Well, they are in terms of that universal 10% tariff, which is a significant hike for a lot of countries. That now, if you are importing from practically anywhere, you're paying that baseline 10%. What Trump suspended over the spring when markets started going crazy over this was those higher rate so-called reciprocal tariffs, which were not really reciprocal. They were based on trade figures, and then he put percentages signs next to them, and it was, all very complex. Companies have a little bit more knowledge now with certain countries about what the tariff's going to be. He's negotiated frameworks with the UK, with the European Union, with Japan, with Indonesia, with the Philippines. So some countries are starting to roll in, but for dozens of others, companies really have no idea where that's going to land. But what they have been negotiating is that baseline 10%. So they have had to start making some pretty difficult choices. There's been, again, the evidence is always being revised and numbers are being revised, and we're not really going to know the full details of this for a while. But there's certainly a sense that companies are trying to protect the consumer, at least for now, by not passing on the prices. But that has huge impact for their businesses, for their hiring. We've already started to see that in the numbers, as I said. And how long they can really protect the average American consumer is heavily up for debate before they just say we can't operate our business like this anymore. Now, of course, to be fair and to give the other side of it, there are plenty of people, particularly the ideologues around this. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, perhaps the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who, again, aren't going to say this so explicitly out loud, but would say, well, just means that American manufacturers need to import less. And Trump came very close to saying it. Maybe you'll have fewer dolls for your child at Christmas this year, which really did not go down well. But that's getting to the truth of it. Maybe you are going to import less. Maybe you're not going to have as much option. That is a world of protectionism where tariffs are higher and companies can't afford to import. And maybe that is what they're looking to do. But the massive question for the administration continues to be, if you start cutting off consumer choice in America of all countries, where people consider that to be a pretty big part of the way of life, and a good one too, the fact that you can come from all over the world and have choice of things that you want. It's a big selling point of why people want to come to America. If you start cutting that off and it doesn't replace itself in the country with more manufacturing, with more production, how do you explain that in the midterms next autumn? How do you explain to people that the cost of things that they like has gone up and that they haven't been replaced by Made in America tags because companies haven't been able to afford or haven't been able to get their act together to do that in America, or haven't wanted to? I mean, countless reasons that a company might decide that they're not going to move their manufacturing base or they're going to change their behavior. It doesn't strike me that that they're preparing to answer these questions. I think they are really, really hoping that the headline figure of how much money is being raised will speak for itself. But you cannot trick an American business owner into thinking that they're not paying that tax. You can't trick an American worker into thinking that they've had a pay raise when they haven't.
But would you not accept that, okay, taking the labour market figure aside, which, as you say, Trump obviously is upset about, the predictions of, economic disaster for America and the world off the back of this, certainly for America, hasn't really come to pass?
Well, again, I think it kind of depends on what you consider to be disastrous. I think when Trump announced those tariffs in the Rose Garden at the start of April, the market reaction was pretty dire. And let's be clear, Trump is not a man who likes to back down and likes to fold. In fact, I would argue that when he blinked on those tariffs and when he rolled them back and said, actually, I'm going to delay this by 90 days, it was one of the first times in Trump 1.0 and 2.0 that we have seen such a climb down. And I think it has
But the market sell-off that sort of triggered that's recovered. I mean, the S&P is up compared to when Trump was elected.
Oh, no, it certainly has. But it scared him enough that he was, that clearly the administration was thinking to themselves, what have we actually done here? He also pivoted from listening to Lutnick and Peter Navarro, the people who are, again, ideologues around tariffs, to being more in the Scott Bessent camp,
sure,
who historically has not been somebody who's been out there saying we need massive tariffs now, but has certainly capitulated to the president's point of view, at least publicly. So he made a lot of changes, and one of the main reasons the market's recovered is because he pivoted more towards those who are considered to be traditional and a bit more free market on this stuff. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I think they freaked out when they realized that, it was people who are saving for retirement who were noticing all of the red lines on the television, and they couldn't tolerate that. There are big questions about how much markets have now just factored in that this is going to be the new way of life, but they are also factoring in the fact that the president is going to be getting deals. Now, as you know from going over with a fine tooth and comb the UK's deal, these are not comprehensive frameworks. Although I would like to say, there is no doubt, at least on the American side of the Atlantic, that the UK did a very good job there. I mean, Keir Starmer has a pretty favorable name recognition, I think, in parts of DC now, because it's thought that he got the first deal. He's actually probably done the best negotiating amongst countries.
Why do you think this is? I mean, I think even Starmer's worst critics in the UK would concede that he's done a reasonably good job in getting that deal with Trump to keep us on the lowest tariffs. Is that a Brexit win, or is this because Trump genuinely personally likes Keir Starmer?
It might be a combination of all of it. The UK clearly decided to prioritize getting that deal, and Ambassador Mandelson over in the States, was really striving for it. They wanted it. They really wanted to get that deal, and they wanted to get it first. And so the drive to do it, I'm sure, helped. Trump needed a deal. Again, let's go back to April when the markets are freaking out, when he's rolling back. He needs to show some sign that he's actually going to try to negotiate something and not just shove these massive percentages onto the world. So he needed it too. When we listen to Trump talk about Starmer, it's quite amusing, actually, for the past year. There's always a little hint of like, well, yeah, he's a bit left-wing, or he's more left-wing than I am. But his big comment is always, but he's a winner. He's a winner like me. He won big. He won big in that last election, and that's true. And I think he probably looks at the prime minister as a winner like him. I'm not sure the prime minister necessarily returns that sentiment with the president, but whatever is happening, these are two men who I think Trump clearly respects Starmer and is very happy to work with him. So I think a combination of all those factors helped. Just to quickly go back to the disastrous point. What does one consider disastrous? Do the markets have to be crashing in real time all the time to still be in a pretty disastrous situation where businesses, investors are nervous all the time about what change is going to occur and are looking everywhere for indicators of recession now? And in addition to that, are trying to figure out with very little guide what a world looks like if America starts importing less. What does that mean for GDP? What does that mean for job opportunities? What does that mean for your average American worker and consumer? Because Trump just did this, where, it's the Trumpian way. Most presidents, if they wanted to completely rearrange and reshape global trade order, would have some kind of plan in place. Trump's just done it and kind of asked companies to respond. I think it speaks very well to American business, big and small, that markets clearly have some reason to believe and some hope to believe that despite these tariffs, American companies will work around it. Despite these taxes, American companies will still thrive and be successful. I think that's often the case in the States, that they'll figure it out. But that's pretty much what Trump has said to these companies, figure it out. And nobody really knows if they're going to be able to, if they're going to want to.
And how do you think Trump plays this going forward? I mean, let's say that all the worst predictions, do come true. American businesses, blame Trump for taxing them. American consumers experience price rises and start to blame the administration for it. Is he, just totally wedded to tariffs and will just push on anyway? Or could we see, a complete reverse ferret and he says, job done, we've bought in 300 billion, we can get rid of the tariffs now?
We may not get to a point where the voter is really making this decision, or Trump has to go up against the average voter to find out how Americans feel about this. The courts may get there first. So a huge hurdle is that the US Court of Appeal has now come out and said that Trump's tariffs are not legitimate, that it was not okay to do that by executive order. And to put this in very simple terms, the president does have the ability via executive order to address certain regulations and changes within trade. But the strong feeling is that because tariffs are taxes, this is something that needed to go through Congress.
Right.
And you could not just sign away with an executive order. This is now very tricky. On the one hand, it's going to play into, at least for a while, a narrative that Trump loves, which is that the institutions are out to get him, the courts are all rigged, it's him against the world, and the MAGA base really enjoys that narrative too. This is probably going to go to the Supreme Court now, a Supreme Court that is considered to be conservative leaning, a Supreme Court that is, and when I say conservative, I don't actually mean Republican, I mean strict interpretation of the Constitution.
Right.
And this is a conservative court that could well decide that, yeah, if you want to hike taxes or cut, this is going to have to go through Congress, like the one big beautiful
bill. Would it get
did.
through Congress if he was forced to go that way?
I mean, that's the multi-billion-dollar question now, and I think much harder to get through Congress than the one big beautiful bill, because whilst he did have to go up against a couple of Republicans, including Senator Rand Paul, when it came to the one big beautiful bill, largely the party was on board with cutting tax. And the Republicans who weren't on board with the bill still wanted to cut tax, but they said, you can't pile this onto the deficit. We have a spending problem, Mr. President, which America does, like the UK. Mm-hmm. But in this case, it won't, you won't even have that general universal opinion within your party that a lower tax rate is broadly speaking a good thing. You will have a completely divided Republican Party between the protectionists and the free traders, and people who think that the tariffs are just, the worst thing you can do. In every case, you should always cut your tariffs. They're a tax on your own people. And the other side, increasingly Trumpian and MAGA, which would say, no, this is the only way that we're going to rebalance trade in our favor. Very difficult to see how he gets that through Congress, especially before the midterms, which could mean that Congress is no longer in the Republicans' hands. My personal opinion, one of the biggest mistakes Donald Trump has made in his second term so far is to have a Congress that is Republican, to have a House and a Senate in your control. In theory, you still got to negotiate, and that's why he won't do it. But to have people who are broadly on side and to not use them to actually implement your agenda. Everything Trump signs, another president, the next president, can come in and sign away too. And so he would have to go through Congress if the Supreme Court said, this is not legitimate. Who knows? I'm not going to make a prediction about what they would or wouldn't say. Just because the U.S. Court of Appeal says one thing does not mean that the Supreme Court will necessarily agree. But on this particular point, there's a lot of people think that the Constitution is pretty clear about it. So you could see a world where the courts make this decision for Trump long before he has to.
So just picking up on what you're saying there about Trump versus the institutions, and also America's spending and debt crisis, which in many ways is quite similar to the one that we wrote on the cover of the magazine last week about the UK. When I was speaking to people for that piece, one of the fears that they kept raising was if Trump does manage to get, someone subservient to him running the Fed, then American monetary policy, potentially becomes out of control. Inflation comes back, and that will have serious knock-on effects for the bond market and for treasuries and for gilts. How do you think that's going to play out?
Understandably, the world's concerned, and they should be, because we never know what Donald Trump's going to do. But I would say this, and I would not put it past him to oust the Fed chair. I would not put it past him to essentially, in all but name, try to take control of monetary policy. I don't think you can rule anything out with Donald Trump. But what I would say is Trump is not ignorant to the basic economic facts of life. I think he really does believe, he's decided that these tariffs are the way to go. I think he's wrong, but Trump is, lots of people like to paint him as stupid or uneducated on points, especially when it comes to economics. And I don't buy that. This is a man who has been in big business for many decades. He's very familiar with market turmoil. He's very familiar with all the things we've been discussing. And I can't believe that he doesn't understand the havoc he could unleash were he to overhaul the Fed in the way he's talking about.
Sure.
Not with like a sustained, clear plan that gets bipartisan agreement about the fact that, as you know and have written about on many occasions, Michael, central bankers keep getting it wrong and something's got to give. Not in that way, in the simple, like, you're out, here's my guy or gal way. I have to believe that Donald Trump realizes that the chaos he would create, and not in the fun way. He loves chaos, but he doesn't love when America is losing. And that's why he paused those tariffs back in April, right? Because looking at the reaction from investors and looking at the state of the market, he didn't like the sense that America might be losing, if even for a short period of time. And that makes me think that, not that the threats are empty, but that it probably isn't his ideal scenario to overhaul the Fed. His ideal scenario is that everybody inside the Federal Reserve now might start slashing interest rates. He loves to spend money. He loves to borrow money. He loves to spend money. He wants them to do that. I don't think this is the fight that he was ever actually looking to have, though. He's got bigger and better plans, like ending wars and apparently bringing in massive taxes on American businesses. I don't think this is what he wants his legacy to be. He just wants them to play ball. I think it's very problematic what he's doing. I think there also needs to be some wider recognition, not that the Fed or the Bank of England hasn't been independent, but during COVID especially, did any of us ever think central banks were going to go against government policy, or central banks were going to turn around and say, sorry, I'm no longer funding that?
Oh no, they completely funded every policy that governments wanted to pursue.
Yeah. They turned on the money printers and they just kept going, regardless of any economic sign that, maybe this was going to cause a problem. They were all very flippant about whether or not inflation was going to resurface. They all said it was transitory. So I think that we have to be slightly careful to pretend that up until January this year, when Donald Trump went back into the White House, that we had a completely independent central banking system that never got complicated with the wants and needs of politicians. I think that's been a little bit hypocritical. Donald Trump has a very aggressive way sometimes of bringing necessary conversations to the surface. I'm not sure he always has the solutions, but it is completely reasonable to say, well, wait a second, you seem willing to play ball for one set of politicians and not so willing for another. I think that's a very reasonable complaint. I'm not sure that sending us all into huge crisis by overhauling the Fed in the way he wants to do so is the answer.
Kate, lovely to have you back in London, and thanks for joining us on Spectator TV.
Thanks for having me, Michael.